to see us, because that really doesn't happen very often, and it's challenging to have authors come up to this neck of the woods. So
it's only 5 hours and 15 minutes.
Yes.
Delay.
So your generosity is definitely appreciated. I had a number of people write to me today that they wish they could have been here. Unfortunately, they can't, but they've had me set aside some books. Good. And already had several people come in and purchase the books. So I don't know if that's because Gary's famous or because
I guarantee it's not because of me. So.
Sure. Actually, to be honest, the people that have come in are very familiar with you and had read Hardscrabble Lodge as well. So. So this is Jake Morrel, for those of you that don't know.
Glad to be here.
And Jake had gone to engineering school, as I understand. And when he started working, decided that maybe a desk job wasn't the right thing for him. So a teaching job in Maine, is that correct? Moved him and Beth to Maine, lucky us. And that led to flying lessons and a lifelong love of planes. And after several years of instruction and hundreds of hours of practice, he became a commercial float plane pilot, and I guess the rest is history. They did buy some dilapidated buildings, is my understanding, which has become the Hardscrabble Lodge.
That's
correct?
Right. We created it, yeah.
It's a sporting camp?
Yes.
Okay. And then that was your first book?
Yes.
About their experiences there, and he's also written another, I don't have the title, Dick Folsom, Bush Pilot, A Legend Reflects, and of course Gary Dumond Remembers. So today we also have Gary with us. I'm not going to tell you anything about him because we're hoping that that will come out in the conversation today. So I'm going to let you guys lead the show, and you can talk a little bit about what brought you to writing.
Okay.
And planes.
All right.
And then we'll talk about Gary's life and how that... I'm also very curious how the two of you met and what brought you to want to write a book about Gary. So,
okay.
Okay.
Well, let me go through the early part of it first. I wrote Hardscrabble Lodge first. And Heidi asked, you know, what brought me to write it. Well, about 5-6 years ago, I was diagnosed with a very rare blood disorder. And fortunately, it was something that could be taken care of, but it took a couple of years to get it under control. And I was supposed to take it easy. And I don't take it easy well, so I was going nuts, you know. And somebody suggested, actually a lady from England, I was caretaking for her island. And we talked numerous times about various things that happened in the woods. So she says, you should just start to set that stuff down. So I started, but I really struggled with it. I'd throw that clipboard. I finally got to the point where one of them worked, one story. And then that gave me the confidence just to keep writing. So Hardscrabble Lodge is 36 stories, all true, most of them involving flying, that happened on Spencer Lake, which is about 40 air miles west of Greenville. And the way we came to Spencer Lake, we started teaching. And then right opposite the school, it was a boarding school, and right opposite the boarding school was Poverty Flats Airstrip. And Poverty Flats Airstrip had about 20 airplanes at the time. Most of them were World War II vintage or a little after. It was very busy. People were flying every single evening if the weather was fit. So I used to go over there and watch. Finally, I ran into somebody that actually had a plane over there, and I got a ride. And I knew that's what I wanted to do. So without telling Beth, I went and bought a plane. And at that time, planes were about $1,600, and a Skidoo at that time probably cost $900. So, I mean, it wasn't all outdoors. It's not like you had to be wealthy at that time to buy a plane. And then aviation gas, we used to call it 80 octane, was only 35 cents a gallon then. So you literally could go over there. The planes burned about 4 gallons of gas an hour. So you could go over there and fly every night, and it was an affordable thing to do. So I practiced and I practiced, and I I finally was able to secure a set of, actually 3 sets of wreck floats. I put those together, make one good set, and I started practicing on floats. And once I had probably 1,000 hours, I did some flight instruction. Dick Folsom agreed to hire me. And that was the biggest break I ever got, because he's the perfect person to teach you. He had so much experience, and I was flying much more valuable airplanes that I never could have possibly bought. So that seemed just like the dream job. And I did it for a couple of years. And then we used to fly regularly into all these remote sporting camps, delivering guests. And we also had the company parties there once a year at Mensungen. And I liked it so much. We had little tiny kids then who are almost 50 now. And I said, this is what we ought to do. But you couldn't afford to buy an existing set of sporting camps, because at the time they were worth a lot of money. So I happened to take some people into a set of rec camps. They were just dilapidated, you know, some of the camps falling right into the ground over on Spencer Lake, and they had no interest in it. And Beth and I and another couple who we started with made an offer on them very shortly thereafter, and since we were only offering half of the asking price, we didn't dream they'd accept it, but they did. So all of a sudden we had a set of camps to build and a business to build, and we only had one winter. So we worked right through the fall doing as much outside as we could, then worked through the winter on the inside of the buildings, and then about midway through the winter we hit the road and went to all the sporting shows on the East Coast to try to attract customers. And through some miracle, we ended up with a full camp in the spring, and we got the camps done a couple weeks before the guests were supposed to arrive. So we had the best of luck. And we ran that, and we loved it. The only thing that happened that was unfortunate, after about 6 years, I guess, or maybe 7, the paper company decided to build a high-speed logging road right by it. So we went from totally isolated, basically fly in or over 2 hours by 4-wheel drive, to drive anything you wanted to in at 50 miles an hour. And we just couldn't run the business that way, because the place was overrun with people. If we'd wanted to start a campground, it would have been ideal, but we didn't. So we ended up selling it. And this book is about all the work that Beth and I did to rebuild it. And I mean real work. Beth built the chimney. You know, we did a lot of things the hard way because we couldn't afford help. So we start out and we talk about what it was like to rebuild the business, then what it was like to try to attract customers. Then we got to the bulk of the stories, which are all the interesting things that happened involving airplanes while we were there. You know, we had airplanes crash in front of the lodge and the beach. We had fire threaten the lodge more than one time. Very unusual things. They just happened, and they make pretty good little stories. So that's basically the story of Hardscrabble. And I should say that since we didn't have help, the amount of work that Beth did was just staggering. You know, she was cooking for up to 25 men at a time. We only had one menu per meal, but still, that's a lot of work. She was doing all the laundry by hand for all the men, cleaning all the cabins. I was flying and doing outboards all day long. You're pretty busy. I never could do it today. You know, we were in our late 20s, early 30s. You can do stuff like that, but I couldn't right now. So that's Hardscrabble. And then I continued a lifelong close friendship with Dick Folsom. So I'd gone out to coffee probably several hundred times with him. And he would always tell stories. Most of them occurred either during World War II or his early flying days from, say, 47 right up through the 50s. And as he got older and wasn't going to fly anymore, I just felt, geez, we got to record those stories. So I asked him about it, and he was very good with stories. He didn't clam up or anything, and he'd laugh. So we got 2 old-fashioned tape recorders. so that if one calved, why, we'd still have one. We'd set them up, playing them both at once, and we'd be around. We were rebuilding our old farmhouse at the time, and it was all gutted, and we had a barrel stove there to heat it. So I'd be on one side of the barrel stove, he'd be on the other, and I'd just prompt him with the stories I remembered. And he'd go on, and then when he was done, I'd prompt him again. So when we got all done, I transcribed the original tapes. And, you know, to do it, you just had to go backwards and forwards time and time again. And I finally got it all transcribed right in his own voice. And then we put together a lot of his early family photographs. And so what Dick Folsom's book is his own words and his own family pictures. And in addition, for $4 extra, you can get the remastered discs of him actually telling the stories. And that's priceless, because to hear him laugh, and it sounds just like he's in the room. But it covers all the early flying, a lot of early airplane wrecks. It covers his experience in World War II, which is really interesting, because I'd never really heard it from the point of view of a person who was actually on the ground going through all the islands on the way to Japan. And he was in the Army Air Force, and don't ever call it the Air Force for those guys. And their job, once we took an island, usually there would be a Japanese strip on it. So our planes could go in right away, but their job was to go and get as much of the wreck planes running as they could. So that's what he did. And they would fly to other islands, get these things patched up so they were good enough to fly to a place where there were mechanics, because we were short of planes. And until I heard him tell it, I didn't realize that, but they were flying junk over there as they got toward Japan, because so many things had been destroyed. And the new ones weren't arriving fast enough. So that's why his job was really important, patching these things up. He actually was on a barge getting ready for the invasion of Japan when the war ended. So, you know, I found that part really interesting. And then he talks a lot about hermits. At one time in the woods, between trappers and guys that just wanted to be by themselves for various reasons, there were probably, between here and Greenville, might have been 20 people living in cabins. And just like Gary did when he was a warden, in the wintertime especially, Dick would detour to fly over a cabin to make sure smoke was still coming out. So you were just sort of informally checking on these guys all the time. And they, as a courtesy, they would drop off mail and groceries sometimes and that kind of thing. The flip side of it is, quite often they had to spend the night out because the weather collapsed on them. And they knew so many of those guys, they'd just head to the nearest place that had food and a cabin and a host, and they could spend the night rather than try to sleep in the woods. So that part was good. And then we get to Gary. Everyone knows Gary. The way I met Gary, Gary was warden when we were in Hardscrabble. So at that time, especially during changeover, which is when you're putting on your floats in the spring, the wardens all used to come and tinker in on their planes in the hangar, Fish and Game hangar, which is right next to Folsom's hangar. So I'd be working in Folsom's hangar on our planes. He'd be working over there. We shared parts all the time, and we shared knowledge because they had Howard Lamberson, who was just a brilliant mechanic. We had Leonard Gould and Dick Folsom. So if there was a problem with an engine or something, those three guys were always getting together and they could solve anything. So it was a pretty close relationship at that time. So I got to know them. And then after I did these books, I was at a meeting in Bangor where they asked me to talk about Dick's book. And Gary was there. We got to talk. And on the way home, I said to Beth, you know, there's a guy that's probably got more good stories than anyone I know. And we ought to sit down, if he wants to, and and see if we could record them. So I broached it with Gary. He was enthusiastic about it. So in March of this past year, I came up for a weekend to his house on Eagle Lake, and we recorded, and then I took it home and I transcribed it. And the good thing, by the time I did Gary's book, I had a digital recorder, which is so much better than a tape recorder. And one of the great things it can do is play at 50% speed without distortion. So when I went to transcribe his book, I could slow it down so I didn't have to cycle so much. I still had to stop it, but the words were usually never blurred. I knew exactly what he said. Whereas when you try to do it with someone like Dick or Gary at full speed, you'll struggle sometimes, and you'll have to go over and over it again. And by the way, for any of you that play musical instruments, that's a common use of these things. You can make it play a segment, say, 15 seconds long over and over again, and you can either play it at full speed or at 50% or anywhere in between. So people that are trying to learn, say, a fancy cadence or something on a violin, they can hear a professional do it over and over and over again, and it's not the same as hearing him do it full speed, because you realize what he's really doing. So what we did with Gary's book is, basically we talked about all the things wardens do, and we sort of separated them into categories. And then, as anyone who knows him realizes, his memory is incredible. So we started with each one, and he would just think of all the incidents that happened, for instance, in searches for lost people, or in drownings and all that. And he was able to recall dates, places, people's names, incredible. So we got all that done, and then I transcribed that. And then we had just this great luck. It turned out that Gary had Mac Mayhew's slide collection. And Mac Mayhew was a warden, started probably in 48 or 9. And his hobby was photography, and he took beautiful slides. So I had the slides, and I was able to find a slide scanner. It's not like a big scanner, it only does slides. But it turns one slide into, I think it comes out at something like about 4 megabits of data. And they're perfect, as long as you clean the slide with a microcloth. So we included about 30 photographs of Macs. Many of them that date from the 50s, you know, shots of like Eisenhower standing on the dock and all those things. They're really nice pieces of photography. And that's included in Gary's book as well. And I've talked too long, so Gary should tell us something.
Mac Mayhew that he talks about there, he was the first warden pilot in Eagle Lake in 47.
47.
Yeah, and he was there till 56. 56 he moved to Greenville. And he was one of the original 3 or 4 warden pilots, and he was assigned to Eagle Lake, lived in the camp there. Before, there was no hangar back then, there was no house like the pilot lives in now, it was just an old camp. But the reason they chose Eagle Lake is they were thinking about Portage. Well, Portage is, the way Portage is situated, the wind blows there all the time. It's a hard place to keep an airplane, because an airplane's kind of like a baby. You got to take care of it when it's in the water, and you got to have a place that's sheltered. And that's why at Eagle Lake, people have asked me over the years, why is the pier there that the docks are hitched to? The only reason the pier is there is to break. It's a breakwater when you have a strong southwest wind, and the airplane doesn't get beat up tied to the dock. The rest of the time, any wind that comes there didn't bother. So that's why they chose Eagle Lake as a plane base. And Jake's book, Dick Folsom, when I was pretty young. I was in grammar school. I knew who Dick Folsom was. I'd never met him. I can remember one time they'd land on the river here right behind the old Masonic building, and in come an Aeronica sedan, which was a 4-place airplane. Jake had one of them, And of course, you know, he didn't get stopped, and I was down there. I was probably about 11 or 12 years old, and he was picking up a set of batteries, and I didn't know this at the time. I just remember what they were loading in the airplane. It took 2 men to lug it. It was those big batteries. They were going to Nugent's camps. I found this all out 25 years later, you know. And that was on the river in Fort Kent. I want to say probably around 1961 or something, you know. And Dick Folsom was a friend of my father's. He became a close friend of mine. Just a real gentleman. I've got a set of the tapes that Jake did with him. It's just like he's sitting there. It was really something. That book is very aviation oriented, but it's got such good stories about like the war days and the days of the flying service. He formed that flying service in the late 40s, and that operated till what, 10-15 years ago.
Yep.
And that was the biggest seaplane operation east of the Mississippi for a long time. And he was just a real gentleman. When I was a young fella, went to work warden service. I remember the first year I went to work was Thanksgiving Day in the snow, and I was in Greenville. And I didn't really know him well, and I was staying in the headquarters. He come over and get me to have Thanksgiving dinner with them. You know, you don't forget things like that. And the book, Beth and Jake's book right here, this is for anybody. It's got a lot of flying in it, but it's got the hard work that they did. I know what it looked like when they went there, because I've been there. I'd like to have a dime every fish I've hauled over there over the years, and they built a heck of a business there. Pauline's read it. This is just a really great book. This book ain't too bad either. he did that's his. He did the work on this. I just talked, and he put it into a book, and he did a really good job with it. And a lot of the photos in there, they're from Mac Mayhew's collection. He was I didn't know that till after he retired. I only worked with him for a few months, but I knew him when I was a kid. I remember going to the plane base in Eagle Lake when I was 8, 9 years old. My father, because they'd sit in the camp and they'd play cards. I'd go sit in his airplane tied on the lake. There was no hangar then. I remember sitting in that in the cold in the winter. It was quite something. That, you know, 4-place airplane, you know. And but the book is the pictures in there are. I couldn't believe how well they came out, because those pictures, a lot of those pictures were taken right here in Eagle Lake. You want to talk about a legend. Mac Mayhew was a legend. And I still got old people that, Mrs. Brown, that she died a few years ago, lived across the road. She'd always ask me about Mac. He lived here for 8 or 9 years, you know.
He also was one of those people that you run into occasionally. Everything he did well. His photography's good. He was just an expert pilot. He could work on planes to perfection, and he built his camp on Wilson Pond, and it's just, nothing's out of place. The camp's perfect. You know?
When you put nails so far apart, they weren't, so they're supposed to be 12, they weren't 15, they were 12. and everything, you're right. You know, I'm lucky, because when I came to work, the pilots that were working were all really good aircraft mechanics. Dick Folsom was a tremendous aircraft mechanic. That's how he really got started in aviation. The guys I worked with, I learned so much from them the first couple of years. I learned how to paint really good, you know, from Andy Stinson, and we did a lot of that back then. That's the way it was, you know. He talks about changeover being the time, like right about now, things are starting to freeze up. You don't stay on floats too late, because it gets to be hard flying. Every takeoff, the water sprays on the floats, it freezes. Sometimes it don't thaw till next spring. So after a while, you take the floats off, you put the wheels and skis on, and you operate off an airport till the lakes freeze. And then the same in the spring. In the spring, just in reverse. When it got bad enough so that it was time to be landing in Greenville on the lake and into the hangar, you know, like a week later, you couldn't have done it because the ice was going out. So we'd spend 3 weeks to a month there in the spring, and the same in the fall. In the fall, we'd stay there till we get 3-4 inches of ice. We'd warm the engine up, and off we'd go. Sometimes we'd take off in the driveway. The driveway wasn't very long. It's about from here to Tim Reeves' building. They're about 350 feet long.
You know, the reason that Dick was good with engines is interesting, because in the 30s, he ran the mailboat on Moosehead Lake. At that time, there wasn't a road to Rockwood. So they had some kind of an old launch that would go almost 30 miles an hour. But the mail went all the way up as far as Ogons and then reversed every single day. So they went through the engine in the boat on about a seasonal basis. So Dick took it and he started to overhaul the engines on the boat every year. And the guy that owned the boat could tell that, you know, he had a mechanical gift. He knew what he was doing because the engines really lasted that he did. So previous to the war, I think in about 38, he decided he'd go to aviation school. So he went to aviation school, Spartan School of Aeronautics in Oklahoma. And he passed that course. Well then, what was he going to do? Well, everyone said there was big money at Pratt & Whitney. So he went down to Pratt & Whitney, and they hired him. And they, of course, knew that he had some engine experience, so they put him in what was known as Pratt & Whitney test. And what Pratt & Whitney test did was torture these engines that were going to be in all the World War II planes. They'd run them way beyond their capacity for days at a time until they self-destructed. And then they would determine which part went first and try to work on the whole thing until they could make it as bulletproof as possible. And anyone that knows anything about Pratt & Whitney, I mean, they are the jewels of engines. They really did it well. So then, when it came time for the war, the military, of course, screens people for, you know, what they can and can't do. And once they found out that Dick had worked for Pratt & Whitney test, and of course the military planes were going to have Pratt & Whitney engines, they got him right into the Army Air Force as a mechanic. And one of the interesting stories he tells in the book is that they flew a lot of what everyone's familiar with as DC-3s. They had a different designation, but they had Pratt & Whitney engines. So they were flying a bunch of generals around, and Dick wasn't flying, but he was on the maintenance staff, and they were trying to get the engines started in the DC-3s so the generals could go to the next island. And anybody that's been in the military realizes when the big wigs are around, it's a very important time. And one engine just wouldn't go. So the big bosses were very irritated, and the guy that was actually in charge of the line crew, he was totally frustrated. And so Dick said, I made the biggest mistake that anyone ever makes in the military. I raised my hand. And actually one of the generals asked him what he wanted, and he says, sir, I think I know what's wrong with that engine. And of course now you're making the guy look bad that's actually working on the engine. So the guy that's working on the engine snaps right around and he says, Folsom, if you're so smart, get up here and fix it. And Dick says, ooh, pressure's on. And what he was pretty sure of was that there's a poppet valve in the carburetor. That's a valve that has a spring and a little ball. And he knew from Pratt & Whitney tests that they stuck all the time. And the fix was simply to take a brass hammer and tunk the carburetor on the side, and it would free the ball. So Folsom walks up, he gets in the box, gets a brass hammer, and goes, tunk. Everyone laughs. And then the crew chief goes, bum, 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 bum. She roars right to life and runs. So he says, boy, if that hadn't worked out, I'd be in trouble. And the guy never spoke to me the entire time that I was in the service. So I found that pretty interesting. The other thing that's interesting is in one of his reconnaissance missions where they were going to pick up a battered airplane, they saw the entire fleet that was in harbor getting ready for the Battle of Midway. So this is a super secret battle. And just from flying, you know, grunt guys on the military scale looking down, here are all our planes. So they knew a big battle was coming up. And I asked them, because they heard so much of this, I said, did you know that we were going to drop a bomb? And he said, no, I didn't. He said, they sent us to classes to talk about atomic energy and how it was the wave of the future and all that, but they never mentioned that they were working on a bomb. So here are these guys that are right there and talking to military people all the time. That secret was kept from them. So they did a pretty good job of keeping that undercover, I would say. So, I talked a long time. Does anyone have any questions?
I have a question for Gary. You flew a helicopter also?
Yeah, I've been, you're always a helicopter, you're always a pilot once you fly.
So you can fly either?
Yeah, matter of fact, I am a flight instructor in helicopters also. Okay. I haven't used it for years. But when I was in high school, I mean, I was an airplane nut, okay? And I knew I wanted to fly, and really, George Pooler, I got to give him credit. He was a teacher in high school, and I get a flying magazine, and it had an ad on it, and it said high school to flight school. Geez, I perked right up. And I remember bringing that to school, and I showed it to George Pooler. George said, well, if you don't try, you will never know, will you? So my junior year, I started in the process. Hey, remember, you're 17 years old, you know? And I applied for Army flight school. It was quite a process. I had to go to Bangor. It was 7 tests. Lasted all day. It was in like segments. And I remember, listen, I just barely made it into that, because you really should have had algebra. Now, where I did good is some of the tests were very aviation oriented. Like they'd show a bunch of instruments and they'd say, what's that airplane doing? Well, I knew that. The guy next to me that was a college graduate that never flew, he didn't know anything about that, but he could do good on the other stuff. I remember the test, you had to get a score of 320 out of 4 something, and I got like 335, but you know what? I was the only one that passed out of 16. So then you've qualified that part. Then you have to go take a first-class medical at Loring. You know, I'd never taken a medical in my life. I didn't. So I remember Dad gave me a ride over. They made an appointment, and I took a first-class medical at Loring. I got through that. I remember I had to have one tooth out. I'd come back. Then the recruiter, you know, he'd come every couple of weeks. So the high school, he said, well, this is where we stand. He says, now, he says, you've got to go to Portland for an interview. Now, when you get to this stage, they're already doing background checks on you. You know, I didn't know this at the time, but when you're going to be an officer and stuff, there, you know, there's stuff involved. So I go to Portland. I flew down on Aroostook Airways, and the interview, there was a general, a colonel, and there was a lady that just worked in one of the offices. And it, you know, I had no idea what they're going to do. Well, it didn't last more than 15 minutes. But I remember I had a nice sport jacket and a tie, and there was other people there to take interviews, you know, and it would have been for officer school, not necessarily flight school, but, you know, you had to. So when I get in my turn, I go in there, and then I remember the lady says, oh, you're looking pretty good there. She says, who helped you get dressed? Well, geez, my mother, you know, wouldn't have been my mother. I wouldn't have looked like that. That's what. And there was a few other questions. That was it. So I get back, and you don't hear nothing till you see the recruiter again a couple of weeks later. Hey, he says, we're in business. So then you're accepted, okay? And I'm still in high school. And they start setting up a date. So I know that I'm going to, by the time I got accepted, I was well into my senior year. And they said, you're going to go the second week of January to basic training. Now, nothing is guaranteed. They guarantee you're going to go to flight school. They don't guarantee you're going to make it. So you go to your normal basic that everybody goes to 8 weeks, and that was all right, you know. Boy, when I got to Texas, to flight school, oh my God, you just can't imagine what it's like OCS, except you half of the day you're on the flight line, you're taking, you know, so they don't bother you there the rest of the time. Holy jeez, listen, I was ready to quit after 3 weeks. It was brutal. I mean, they'd come in and they'd wear a white glove, and you'd be two students per room. They'd reach under the sink, see if they could find any dust. Your stuff I still get pictures of my locker. I mean, you'd have your stuff lined up, and if the shirts were 1.25 inches apart, they weren't 1 1/8 inches, they were 1.25 inches. It was brutal. But that's what they want. They just, as you went along, it got easier. And as they get more money invested into you after about 20 weeks, it got a lot easier. But I mean, you can't imagine the dropouts. I mean, the first couple of days, I think our class was like 180, and we were down to like 130. Some said, I don't need this. And then you lost some in the way. Some people just didn't have the flying, but that was rare. Most of the people, it wasn't because they couldn't fly, it was just that they didn't want to put up with the see, that school lasted 48 weeks. The first half of it was in Fort Walters, Texas, which is just west of Fort Worth. It's called their town there, Mineral Wells is the name of it. And you got basic training. Then from there, you went to one or two places. You went to Fort Rucker, Alabama, which is the home of Army Aviation, or you went to Hunter Army Airfield in Savannah. I got selected to go to Hunter. Same training, just two different locations. Then all of a sudden, when you get there, it's the real thing. Ain't any more toy helicopters. It's Hueys, and that was 20 weeks of training. Okay, and then you know you're going, but you also know they're not training you there there's a war going on. And so with about 2 weeks to go, you know you're going to graduate and stuff, and then everybody gets their orders, and we're sitting in the room, and they start giving, you call your orders, and they say where you're going, and of course, more than 95% were going to Vietnam. A few went to Korea. I remember 1 or 2 went to Alaska. But you're 19 years old, you're not worrying about a war. My father was home worrying about it, but that's. I remember Dad used to tell me, about halfway through flight school, once in a while I'd call and he'd say, "You tell them you don't want nothing to do with them helicopters. You want to fly airplanes." And that's what I wanted to do. But there's, you got to get at it one way or the other. And I remember one day one of the TAC officers, I said to him, I said, "Listen," I said, he says, "Young fella," he said, "you want to drive a helicopter or you want to push an M16 through the rice paddy?" We finished up in the helicopter. That's the way it was. You had a month off, come home for a month, then you went to Vietnam. And that was the real thing. I don't regret it. You do what you got to do. I flew a lot there in a year, 1,400 hours, in a year. Of course, I was young. I didn't take an R&R. Just flew the month of November 1970. I flew 30 straight nights, and I get the IBM readout. The weather ain't always good every night. The war doesn't stop because the weather's bad or the wind's blowing 50. It was fabulous training. Just get you into the right mode, because you got to be thinking all the time. I mean, it's a war going on, and I lost some good friends over there. But when I was coming home, to get married, and we were going to go to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I was going to be an instructor pilot. About a month before I get released, they came out with an early out program. Because the war in '70, it was starting to wind down, and they said, if you want to get out, when you get back from Vietnam, you sign on the dotted line. I didn't dislike the military. I wanted to go home and fly float planes and ski planes and stuff. And so I applied for an early out, and I got home. We got married. We went to Prescott, worked for Rustic Airways for 4 or 5 months, and then along in August I got hired as the forestry's first helicopter pilot. And that too was a chance. That's what got me the job, is the helicopter thing, but they also had float planes and stuff, and so I went to work for them. A little over a year. We moved to Old Town, And then along in August of '72, we had a warden pilot. Well, I was still working for the forestry. There was a warden pilot that had been stationed in Eagle Lake. Name was Dick Varney. Dick drowned in a helicopter accident, and it was in late September of '72. And they needed a pilot right away, and of course they knew who I was. I taught two of their pilots to fly helicopters the previous year, Andy Stinson and George Lader. George Lader calls me and he said, "You still want to be a warden pilot?" Well, I'll tell you, I wasn't long headed to Greenville to talk to him, and a couple of weeks later I was a warden pilot, and I was stationed in Old Town with the understanding that in the spring I was going to move to Augusta, because that's where the opening was. Well, along in the winter they had a reorganization and they weren't going to have a pilot in Augusta, so they decided that I'd stay right in Old Town, which was good for us. And that's how I got into warden service, and that's what I wanted to do growing up. I didn't want to be a pilot. I wanted to be a warden pilot. But the chances of being a warden pilot, when I got hired, I think I was the 10th one they ever hired since '46. It's not a job anybody leaves, okay? So when I got a job in forestry, I figured I was pretty lucky, because that was a pretty good job. But when I got a chance to go to warden service, I was gone, you know. And I did that.
How many years were you a warden pilot?
I worked in Old Town till as a warden pilot till '85, and in '85, Jack McPhee was the pilot here in Eagle Lake, close friend of mine, and he retired, and we decided we're moving to Eagle Lake, and which is what I wanted to do when I was a kid, you know. So, there's a lot of luck goes with things, you know. I could have been a warden pilot in Old Town the rest of my life. I'd been tickled to death, but you know, that's how I ended up in Eagle Lake. And I did that till '91, I think. Yeah, the fall of '91. I got done right after hunting season, and they didn't want me to go. I don't mind telling you that. But we were buying Dad's skidoo business, and I had been doing both. I had bought the business a year before, Paul, about a year earlier, and good old Dad was there with Paul and Pauline, and they were running the show, and I'd go out and fly, and the weather's bad, or I'd day off, I was at the shop. But you know, you couldn't be out looking for a lost hunter in bad weather, wondering did they get that sled together today, and I did it for a little over a year. You know, my father didn't want me to ever retire. I mean, I don't know if he probably figured he was going to work there forever. But when I was eligible for a retirement, which was a fabulous retirement. They don't have that good a retirement now, and that's how I ended up getting done warden service. Well, I didn't fly much for 6 or 7 years. And we had bought the skidoo business, and we'd bought a piece of property on the lake, and I'd be there sometimes in the spring and summer, and the airplane would come and go, and she'll tell you, sometimes I'd look out and I'd watch the airplane go, and I'd tear up. So it went a while, and I started filling in a little bit part-time here and there. Along in the 90s, well into the late 90s, then there was a little more changeover, and they'd have a new pilot, and I'd get involved in helping train some of them. And also I started going to Alaska in early 2000s. We sold the skidoo business in 2003, and I think I flew in Alaska 4 or 5 summers. Some of it was just part summers, like 5 weeks or something. Flew some very interesting people. I flew Olivia Newton-John, Norman Schwarzkopf, General Norman. I wish he was around. He'd straighten this mess out. And what a guy he was. I flew, if you watch the old Lawrence Welk shows, Mary Lou Metzger. Flew her one summer. You know, it was a high-end fishing lodge. And you'd take people fishing. Most of the time you stayed with them. 2 of the years I guided. And after you go one time, what happens in Alaska, there's a lot of pilots that are very well qualified, but they got year-round jobs. So these jobs at the lodges are like 3 or 4 month jobs. So these guys that get good jobs, they can't leave. So it come to the point where it was getting hard to find pilots to fly those type of airplanes, which is a de Havilland Beaver, which is what I flew every year up there. So a lot of the pilots were coming from the States, but there wasn't a lot of people that had, you know, that had experience with Beaver. After you've been there 1 year, first thing you know, they know about you. I mean, I still get calls now, you know. I don't know if I got one this year. Most every year I get 1 or 2 calls. I just don't want to go for 3 or 4 months anymore. But a few years ago I went for 4 or 5 weeks. So what happened about then, there started to be a changeover in warden pilots. And we had a couple of guys that, I say we, and I've been retired for years, but it's still we. We had some pilots get done and they were in a bind, so I'd work a couple months here, fly for them, and then I'd go a year, and then first thing you know, they need me for another couple months. And then about 2.5 years ago, they said, we could use you for 6 weeks. I said, that sounds good. And it was 16 months. But you know what? I'm doing what I really like to do. And this past year, they hired a new young fella, and he's doing a really good job. He was a Marine Resources game warden, but he was not a pilot for them. They decided he needed to go to the regular game warden school, so in June I went back to work for them for a little over 3 months. So that's been that. But I still maintain my flight instructor ratings. I just renewed it. I've been a certified flight instructor 48 years.
Wow. That's a long time.
Lucky, better than working. In Dick Folsom's, the CDs you did there, he makes mention in there about, well, geez, I found out I could fly and I didn't have work. And it's not that easy. When everything is great, it's great. When the weather's bad and conditions are not good, you earn your money. But I wouldn't change anything. I'd do it all again. Maybe if I had to do it again, maybe we wouldn't own the Skidoo business. I'd probably still be the warden pilot in Eagle Lake. They'd have to shoot me.
So I heard a funny little story about you landing a helicopter and a long time ago. I'm putting you on the spot now. And there was a cow that got loose.
Oh, jeez. I didn't think anybody else knew that. When I worked for the forestry, I started in August, and spruce budworm was a big deal then. And we do a lot of survey work. Well, geez, all of a sudden they had a guy that could fly the helicopters, and they just got these helicopters. The Bells, like you used to see on Whirlybird, they're a pretty good helicopter, you know. So they had a survey up here, and they sent me up with the helicopter. And you got to remember, them helicopters, 2.5 hours, you're out of gas. But you could do the survey work. You'd fly along 50 miles an hour over the trees, and the guy'd be there with his clipboard. And there was no GPS and stuff like there is today. So we were up here, and Paulina drove up with the girls. It was been just Marcia then. And of course we'd stay at her mother and father's in the Pearly Brook. I wouldn't do that today. Well, anyway, one day I come in with the helicopter, and her folks live, it's not a very big driveway, and there's a garage there. I landed in the driveway. There was about 5-foot clearance from the garage, the rotor blades. There was enough room, but it was right there. Well, the neighbor had a cow, and it had a chain that was on a pipe driven in the ground. It was all the way down to Frank Martin's where they got it from. That was a long time ago. Cow and trot, and he was dragging a chain. Yeah. One other time, about the same era, because I was still flying forestry, I'd landed what we call the ball field, which is Irving's parking lot. And I'd landed there right in front of Mom and Dad's house. And Edgar Babin comes over. And of course, I grew up next door neighbor, and I gave him a ride at night over town. He wanted to buy a helicopter. He thought that was something.
Gary, you got an award here not all that long ago, and I want to say it was for the amount of hours that you had flown.
No, what it is, it's I don't talk about it, but I'm pretty proud of it. I wish my father would have been here. It's called the. Make sure I get this right. It's called the Wright Brothers Master Pilot Award. 50 years flying continuous, no accidents. And there's other people in the States got it. Andy Stinson was a pilot that worked for Dick Folsom that I ended up working with him. He just died 2 months ago, and I just found out right before he died that he got that award 8 years ago. But it was that was quite an award. It was it's called the Wright Brothers Master Pilot Award. A nice big plaque. And
50 years, no accidents. I want to fly with you.
well, yeah, but listen, there's incidents. Okay, I mean, you know, if you do it, you damage things, and the thing is, you don't hurt anybody, don't hurt yourself, and there's a lot goes with that. Okay, I've lost a lot of friends in aviation. I mean, good friends, and it's almost always pilot error. I don't, you know, once in a while something it happens, but it's rare. It's usually something that's pilot oriented. I mean, if you go out and fly and you're feeling bad and you can't perform right, that's pilot error. That ain't the airplane's fault, you know. And I don't think of it now. Sometimes I say, geez, you know, I've been flying 50. Well, I soloed June 19, 1967. Okay, so it's this June will make 51 years. And that's all I ever wanted to do. But I can tell you, if it wouldn't have been for my father, I'd never been here, because here I was, a junior in high school, and I had an airplane to fly. And all I'd do is put gas in it, and there was a bad accident in Fort Kent right about then. Killed 4 people. And, you know, I had learned to fly, and, you know, maybe if you'd have been older, that'd have scared the hell out of you, but my father didn't really give it a chance to scare me, because I wasn't doing things maybe quite right. Nobody was at the time. And anyway, he said, okay, if you're going to fly, you're going to fly my airplane. You pay the gas. And he took me to Presque Isle, and I flew with an instructor there named John Philbrick. In a couple hours, he signed my logbook so I could fly that airplane. You still got no license. You're a student pilot. But I had an airplane to use. I mean, put gas in. I remember he took a map and he put a line from Daigle Pond to Fort Kent, up to Eagle Lake to Portage, across Madawaska Lake, over to Long Lake, and back to Daigle. You had to stay in that area. That's a pretty good piece of territory. He said, you tell your mother where you're going when you're going to fly. And gasoline, I paid the gas. I was working for Alan Dow. I was making pretty good money in high school, and we used Amoco High Test. It was good stuff.
White gas.
20-some, yeah, it was white gas. It was like 20-some cents a gallon. And I had an airplane to fly right till I graduated from high school, and I went away in the service. And that airplane, which was, my father owned 6 airplanes over the years. I can only remember that one and the one before, the Stinson. But that airplane is still flying. A friend of mine owns it in Bangor. It's a 1947 Piper Cub PA-11. And that airplane, when Dad bought it, I think he paid $2,900 for it, brand new. And he sold it when I was in the service. I remember Mom writing a letter, and we're selling the airplane. Well, if I'd have known, if I'd have had any brains at all. He sold it for $3,500. He thought he did well. He made $600. I had it all those years, and he made a lot of money with it. So I kept track of the airplane. Ray Porter had it, and for a few years, and Pat, and then a postmaster in Howland had it, and I knew the airplane. It had been recovered a different color. Then 2 friends of mine in Old Town bought it, and one of them still owns it today. 4677 Mike, and he's owned it longer than we ever did, you know. But it wouldn't have been for my father, none of this would happen. You know, I just can't believe that he. I mean, you know, back in '67, when you took off with the family airplane, that was the most expensive thing they owned, except for the house, maybe. You know, and. He trusted me. He wasn't big on helicopters. I remember when I got back to flight school, and I went to work forestry, and he was, by then he'd become the troop commander of state police in Orno. So he lived with us. he comes over and I give him a ride in the helicopter. Let's go out in the Beaver. He didn't want much to do with the helicopter. And I flew him in it 2 or 3 times, and he was all right with it, but he wasn't a helicopter guy. On the top of them helicopters, them bells, there's a big nut that holds everything, and it's got safety tabs around it, and that's what's holding you up there. But it's nothing that I never heard of one letting go. But there's also a second nut that's a safety. They call that the Jesus nut. Dad would say every so often, make sure you check the Jesus nut. I mean, you look at it, you see what it was, but,
Dick Folsom tells an interesting story about one of his accidents, because he did have some. And he was with friends, and they were flying from Greenville up to Casey's.
Oh, geez.
Which is, that's a flight of less than 20 miles. And they were going to have a feed of beans and then fly back. So when he left Greenville, in a Cessna airplane, they have big, long, flat tanks. So the gas gauges are notoriously unreliable. But you can look at it and say, yeah, I'm sure I got enough. But the easy way to check it once you're airborne is you kick your rudders a little bit, and that'll slosh the gas so that all of a sudden it'll come right up to full, and then this one's full. There's quite a bit of gas in it. So anyway, he's going up to Casey's, and they get done with their feed, and on the way back there's a little bog place on Sugar Island, and quite often there's moose in it. So he's showing his people the moose, and they're just a few hundred feet high. Well, wouldn't you know, the airplane quits. And so he didn't have much time to fool around with it, and it turned out it wasn't out of gas. It was another problem. But he knew right away he was going to have to land in the trees on Sugar Island, so he headed for the lake the shortest way, hoping that he could make it to the lake, but he was almost convinced he couldn't, which he didn't. But he said when that came down, he thought everything was going to be just violence, because of course this isn't anything you practice. And he says it started through the branches, the top of the tree. They hit a maple tree. And he says, I could hear them snapping all around us. And he says, we get a tunk here and a tunk there, and we just kept going. And then there'd be some bigger snaps, and a tunk here and a tunk here. And all of a sudden, he said there was a thud, and we stopped. And he said, all I could think about is, Jesus, we're 50 feet high, how are we going to get down out of the tree, And he says he opened his door, and there was the ground. They were on the ground. And all it did was, it hurt the wings a little bit. It bent up the nose of one float, and it was at an angle about like that. Well, he was so mad that, because he thought he'd run out of gas. So the plane's sitting like this, and he went and pulled a gas cap, and gas gushed right out of it. So it wasn't, he didn't run out of gas, and it turned out to be a carburetor malfunction. But anyway, somebody saw him go in, and they were right handy to shore, so they picked him up. They got to Greenville in time to see it on the evening news. So.
Yeah, he had Gray Morrison with him. He was a ward supervisor.
Yeah,
I remember that.
Gray and Nancy there, his girlfriend was with him.
And Gray's girlfriend.
Yeah.
See that? My father used to always say, fly the airplane till it stops. And so when an airplane hits and the first thing hits is a nose like that, you're in trouble. Okay? That airplane right there, the pontoons took some of the, and the wings did, they come to a stop. And nobody had a scratch on them.
No.
And you can't quit the flying the airplane when it hits, or it's about to hit. And you got to go straight ahead. You can't start turning right at the last minute. That's when you'll stall and spin, and then,
He also tells the story of George Grinnell, who was a judge that came to Greenville.
Grinnell.
He came from New Hampshire, but over his lifetime he crashed 8 airplanes.
Oh,
And you got to know George and his sense of humor, but he had a photography of early movies. So he had movie footage of every one of these smashed airplanes.
Judge Grinnell.
And he gave it to professional people that spliced it all together with modern equipment. So I sat and watched the spliced 8 accidents altogether. And in the latest one that he had, which was the last one, he had run out of gas and he'd landed just short of a field into the trees and then walked out in the field, and he's being interviewed on TV in Portland on the evening news, and he says, well, when you've crashed as many as I have, you've got a lot of practice and it's easy. That's what he told the lady.
Hey, Warden Services, you know, we've damaged some airplanes over the years. I mean, we've lost 2 pilots, both in the same lake about 100 yards from each other, about 15 years apart. Okay, then we've had some other airplanes upside down in the water. We had one pilot, Mac May, who was as good a pilot as I ever knew. And in a 6 or 7 month period, I can't remember just what it is, it's in the book, he crashed the same airplane 3 times. And it wasn't because, I mean, one of those times was, there was something wrong with the airplane. What had happened?
Was it oil, broken oil?
Yes, had a broken oil line. And it was first week of December. He was headed back to the Fort Kent Airport in late 40s. And he'd just gone by Musquecook Lake, and there was a fairly new camp had been built there. A trapper had built it, and they knew who he was because he was a pilot. And Mac lost the oil pressure. He turned around, and he knew when he landed on that lake that he was going to go through the ice as it stopped, more than likely. And the pictures of it in the book, the airplane upside down. So he landed, and just as he come to a stop, it broke one side, down it went. He never got wet. He climbed up on the tail, but he had to get ashore. And he was pretty close to the camp. And so, you know, finally you got to say, hey, I got to, he gets in, and I think he was in the water pretty deep. He was breaking the ice with his elbows, got ashore, walked down the shore, got into the camp. There's all kinds of dry cedar there and stuff, big pieces like that, no axe. The axe was in the wrecked airplane, in the airplane in the water. He went back in the water, and it wasn't where he normally kept it, but he groped around and found it. It was up under the instrument panel. Went back, that saved his life. I mean, you're not going to get by that. And that same airplane, they rebuilt it, and he was in back of Portage over by Beaver Brook. And I forget what happened there, but he ended up in the woods. There's pictures of that. I don't know if we get them in the book. I got pictures of it. And they're taking it out with a little bulldozer, and they put the wings on, and they're towing it on an old sleigh there. And the third time, he didn't damage the airplane much. He had stopped on Pete's Pond up off the Allagash, pick up some beaver traps that had been set illegally, and they caught the guy. And he went in there to pick up, there was evidence, and it was icy, and there was a little snow, and he caught a piece of driftwood frozen, and he bent the landing gear. Well, geez, it commenced snowing right after that, and he was there. My father worked on that search, and they had an idea where he was because he said he was going to stop at Pete's Pond on the way back and pick up the beaver traps. Well, they could fly up the river to where the outlet of Pete's Pond was, but they just couldn't go up. It's uphill. He spent 2 nights there, and Max told me this. You know, I'm so lucky I get to be around him. There'd been an old trapper in there, and he caught a lot of beaver. And of course, the carcasses were, all they kept was the pelts. And there was all these frozen carcasses. That's what he ate. He'd slice some off and fry it on the wood stove. But you know, if you think about it, I've had beaver meat. I'm sure you have. Yeah. We eat pig, and you know what that runs around in? And beavers in the water. And when I had that beaver stew in Greenville, if nobody had told me, I'd have never known. But anyway, so getting back to Mac, he had, you know, if you fly a lot, and the equipment they were flying, you know, was a little different. There was no radio. He couldn't call somebody and say, hey, I'm over here, come get me. You know, he was there 2 days. And I remember when George later picked him up, he says, what took you so long? I told him, yeah.
Well, I want to thank both of you for being here. These wonderful stories. And I assume there's more in the books, right?
Listen, I'm going to tell you, the book's good. Folsom's book to me, because I've known him and I was a pilot. You want to get this hardscrabble. That's the real thing. That
Yeah. Does anybody else have any questions?
Thanks very much for coming out. Thanks for coming down.
Thank you.
Rock.
Yeah.
him and I, listen, a few weeks ago, him and I went on a radio show in Bangor.
Yep.
And you know, he sent me a message, and geez, you know, I never been on the radio, but I said, okay, we're gonna go. So we meet him there. It's just like you see on TV. They got this round table, and they got these headphones, and you got your own mic. And then there's another room with a window, and there's a guy in there. The guy in there that's running the show is a Norman Plort, originally from Fort Canton. Classmate of his.
I listened to the podcast.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So
Norman was part of it.
while we're doing this show, the first 10 or 12 minutes, we didn't get a chance to say much, but they knew we were there. So this two interesting calls that you could call in. This guy, Levi Sewell. And right away when he said what his name, Levi Sewell is the son of a game warden, a retired game warden. His name was Dave Sewell. I gave him his first airplane ride when he was 6 years old. He called to thank me. Yeah. And I remember, and you know, he's 40 years old, 40-some years old now. This other gentleman called from Vermont. He said, what do you, any of you guys, either of you guys that know about the Warden plane that splashed in through the ice on Musquecook Lake? Well, right away. I said, over by the little camp there, yeah. Well, I said, that was Mac Mayu, and, you know, I said, that's all in the book, there's pictures of it, and he says, well, he spent the night in my camp.
Oh.
I said, no, he didn't spend the night in your camp. I says, your camp is, you bought that from Jimmy Dumond. Well, he was a little, you know, what cousin it was. Jimmy's my cousin, and he brought that camp there, put it in. The camp that Mac stayed in was behind this one, and 20 years ago was still only about 3 logs high. Well, I explained that to him on there, but I mean, that's where it was, you know. But here's this guy listening from Vermont.
Wow.
Small world.
No
That's
kidding.
right. Great stories.
Thank you.
So I have a few requests from people that couldn't be here tonight for you both to sign.
Yep.
Sure.
And I just want to let everybody else know that that's an option. I'm hoping.
I tell you all, if it wouldn't have been for this guy, this book never would have happened. It ain't my cup of tea.
And do you like writing?
I'm never going to do it again, but I learned a lot. You know, if any of you do it or want to try to do it, it's not so much the writing, it's what you go through after. The editing is pure hell. And they're very concerned about things I'm not concerned about. So,
They meaning the publishers? Or
The editor.
well, the
The
editor's
editors?
working for the publishers.
Okay.
And I had to really work on them not to screw the book up. Because, for instance, they, with Gary's stories, they wanted to re-edit it so it sounded like somebody from Boston was telling him. I said, no, you're not going to change a single word. You're going to use the same grammar he used. And you would have thought that I'd put an ice pick in them. They just were pain. But so many people reading that, they like the fact that it sounds like a real person.
Right.
Some of the retired wardens that bought the book, you know, they emailed me or they called me and they said it's just like we were sitting there.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Sounds just like you, right? Yeah.
The other thing that they want to do, to give you a small example, these books are read by a lot of aviation people,
Yeah.
and one of the common airplanes is the Cessna 180. Well, they do not want to write the numbers 180. They want it written out. Well, I want to tell you one thing right now. No one that's ever flown would even recognize the model, you know?
Yeah.
And it's the same thing, a Pratt & Whitney 985 engine is not written out. That's what, and it's P&W, not Pratt & Whitney. You know, so once you hit them over the head a couple times, they come around, you know.
Well, the bookshop gives mugs to people that come and visit.
Oh, thank you.
So you
Thank
each
you.
get one. We don't
Great.
sell these in the bookshop,
Some red
Thank you
Devil
very
roast
much.
coffee.
but I want to thank
I
you.
never had
And
one
then
of those
the
for
Red
5 years
Devil
ago.
makes this roast
Fancy
for
started
the
down
of
there.
coffee, but they do a
All of a
Bogan
sudden,
brew just for the
you know,
bookshop.
I
Great,
different
great.
kinds.
Thank you for coming.
Sure.